Hey, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on when you are tuning in for this week's lecture. So last week we started with public history. What is that? So this week we're starting with the history of sexuality. And you need to understand the history of sexuality because if we want to understand the tension between a scholarly historical approach and a public history approach, we need to understand the particular tensions between a scholarly approach to the history of sexuality and the monument that's being built in Ottawa. So what I'm going to share with you today is the lecture that I used to begin my 100 level Introduction to the History of Sexuality class, because in this lecture, I go over the foundations of a critical approach to thinking about sexuality. And so, as you can see from the slide, the title of the lecture is "Can Reading Gay History Make You Gay?" All right, so let's see what that is all about. So, what is gay sex? Well, what is gay sex? What is it that defines it as gay, that makes it gay? What is the quality or the feature? What is heterosexual sex? What is it that makes it heterosexual? And what causes a person to be gay, straight, or something else? So these are the kinds of questions that we bring attention to how we frame heterosexual and homosexual. And one of the things I'm going to argue today is that in the 20th century, our sexual identity has become a very important part of defining who we are and how others define us. And this wasn't always the case. So let's turn now to our resident expert, Lady Gaga. So if we were in class, I would play her song, Born That Way. I'm not sure if that's actually the title of it. I think it might be. In any case, I can't do that for copyright reasons, but you know the song. So I encourage you right now to get in the mood for today's lecture, to put me on pause and turn that song on and just dance it out. Really, really hard. Give it everything you've got. Okay, so let's carry on, shall we? So what does our resident expert have to say about what causes one to be gay, straight, or something else? So here is the main verse from her song. I'm beautiful in my way, 'cause God makes no mistakes. I'm on the right track, baby. I was born this way. Don't hide yourself in regret. Just love yourself and you're set. I'm on the right track, baby. I was born this way. So Lady Gaga has a theory of sexuality. And that theory is that one is born into the sexuality they have. And that could be a scientific theory, that it's genetic, for example, or biological in some way. So biologically predetermined. But she also suggests that it's God is actually the one who's making the determination. And that's also a very common belief. And in fact, many queer people use the same argument, that God makes no mistakes. I was made this way. And so therefore, it's okay. My sexuality, my sexual orientation is acceptable and justified, and indeed should be celebrated, because it's not an accident, it's not a sin, there's nothing wrong with it. It's completely natural. So this becomes an argument that can be used both to treat gay people as sick, they have something wrong with them, it needs to be fixed, as sinners, or it can be argument that can be used in the opposite direction, to defend and justify and celebrate queerness. Okay, so that's causation, right? In history, we talk about causation. What were the factors that cause an event to happen? So in this case, what causes one's sexual orientation? And according to Lady Gaga, as we saw, it's God that causes it. And so how can we determine if this theory of sexuality is correct. Is it a theory that we can test? Well, when it comes to the God argument, no, we can't. But when it comes to the biological argument, in fact, many people have attempted to try and find some kind of biological determinant which would indicate whether or not someone would be homosexual. So in my lifetime, I've heard about studies that looked at ear size. I've heard about studies that looked at finger length that argued that based on, I think it was the ring finger or the middle finger, if you, by the length of it, you could tell if someone was gay or not. There's a gay scientist, Simon LeVay, I think it's LeVay, who studied the brain because he was sure that he would find something in the brain to show that homosexuality is biologically determined. And of course, there are many, many studies of twins. But none of these studies have ever revealed any kind of biological factor that determines our sexual orientation. And this argument I want to just add about biology goes way beyond just heterosexual sex or homosexual sex or orientation. When I gave this lecture, the next week a student one year came running up to the front of class with her psychology textbook. It was a current textbook. It was the one she was using that year to study. And she showed me on a page, it argued that there is a female proportion of hips, waist, and bust size that men find most attractive. And so therefore there's like a science to the ideal female body, and that this could be proven biologically. So they're, in my opinion, completely ridiculous arguments that are out there. So they're used for more than just explaining homosexuality. So there are two things to notice about this theory. Is first, it assumes that sexual desire is fixed and unchanging. So if God made you a certain way, or you are born a certain way, it's biologically determined, then your sexual orientation doesn't change over the course of your lifetime. But in fact, we know that this is not true. People's sexual orientation does change across the course of their lifetime. Secondly, it assumes that male and female is the central organizing principle to thinking about sexuality, right? So what makes sex gay and what makes sex heterosexual, it has nothing to do with the actual sex act. It just simply has to do with the biology of the two people involved in the act. So a same-sex couple and an opposite-sex couple could engage in the exact same sexual act to the same effect, and one is gay and one is heterosexual, and they're seen as qualitatively different. But I guess the question I would ask is, are they? Why is that so important? So to understand a critical approach to sexuality, and this extends to all disciplines, not just history, but sociology, English, sort of other social sciences, and humanities fields, sees sexuality, well, here, Thomas LaCour said it beautifully and simply: society haunts the body's sexuality. So what does he mean by that? Well, just take a minute now and take out your notepad and just reflect for a moment. What do you think he means by that? And can you think of a way in which society haunts your body's sexuality? Okay, I'm going to continue on, but if you want to keep writing, just pause and then press play. Okay, so this is how historians see causation: that sexuality is a product of society, that it's political, economic, social, and cultural forces that shape our sexuality. It's not determined by a deity or by nature. Okay, I'm not going to stay here for long because my understanding is a lot of you now learn about this in high school. So maybe you've seen the ginger person the gingerbread person. It basically explains this concept here. So it's important to understand the difference between sex and sexuality. And here we see how the intertwining strands of sexuality, right? So desire and attraction does not necessarily mean identity. So there's all kinds of people who engage in same-sex sexual activities, but would never proclaim a bisexual, gay, or any identity other than heterosexual. So the act of claiming a sexual identity is an important social act. So there's a desire, attraction, activity or behavior, and then identity. And there are no clear boundaries between these categories. And this also applies to gender and race as well. Okay, so we have another primary document to have fun with. So my question to you is, what is this? It's okay. We're all grown-ups. You can say it. So in my lecture back pre-COVID times, people would, after getting over their shyness and working up their courage, they would say, well, clearly this is a penis. But it's not. It's not a penis. This is one of the earliest anatomical drawings of a vagina. So what values, what social values and cultural values are expressed in how Andreas Vesalius conceived of the female body? So there's two ways, right? There's two possible interpretations. Either the female body was conceived as a repository for the male organ, or the male organ was seen as an organ that was created to suit the female body. So how would we determine which it was? Well, we would look at other cultural values from that time and place and period. And other cultural values tell us very clearly that it was, and of course we still are in the West, a patriarchal society. So this drawing reflected that value. Now, you're probably thinking, well, okay, that was 1543. Like, we know a lot more now, right? Okay, wait till the end. Wait till the end. So that drawing was created at a time when society in the West had a single sex model. So it was this idea that there was one form and the female body was like an inversion of the male body. And so this piece from a sort of popular cultural book captured that quite nicely. That though they of different sexes be, yet in the whole they are the same as we, the author is male. For those that have the strictest searchers been, find women are but men turned outside in. And men, if they but cast their eyes about, may find their women turned inside out. So this person is having a little bit of fun with it, right? And maybe even the author was a woman, publishing under a pseudonym. And maybe this was a bit of a pushback against patriarchy. Who knows? All good questions that we could ask. But eventually, the one-sex model was abandoned, and we moved to a two-sex model. So it saw the male body and the female body as completely different, right? Apples and oranges. And from that flows gender identity, gender role, sexual orientation, and sexual mode. And we'll see how some of these have been connected and linked in theories, medical theories that sought to explain homosexual desire. So what I'm talking about is the invention of the homosexual. Okay, so this is another really important historical point. So pay attention here. And have a sip of water. It's a big one. A historian named Michel Foucault, who we'll get to in a moment, a French philosopher. He argued that the homosexual was invented in the 1880s. So what did he mean by that? He didn't mean that before the 1880s there was no same-sex sex. What he meant was the modern concept of the homosexual as a type of person who has particular proclivities, particular behaviors, um, and the creating of that behavior as being a very important intrinsic part of one's identity, that whole concept, that's what got invented in the 1880s. And it got invented by medical experts who were interested in studying quote unquote sexual anomalies. And what's really important is when they set out to study sexual anomalies, they studied all of them. Some of the books they produced are this thick with just, they're encyclopedias and they're pages and pages and pages of anomalies. It wasn't clear that homosexuality and heterosexuality was going to become this major defining category in modern society, but that's precisely what happened. But it wasn't always clear, or it wasn't necessarily so that that would happen. So the fun work, the work that I love about history is figuring out why that happened, right? Causation, like what were the social factors that caused there to be this kind of obsessive concern with heterosexuality and homosexuality at that particular period. And one of the arguments that historians have convincingly made is what was happening at the end of the 1800s is white women were having fewer children. And in Canada and the United States, quote unquote, immigrants, so non-whites, of course, some whites were immigrants, but when they talked about immigrants, they meant non-whites, and African Americans, they were continuing to have large numbers of children. So there was a fear that white people would be outnumbered by people of color. So there was this pressure for white couples to have more children. And so as a result, you get growing concern about people who are not having children. So racism, white superiority actually drives what's going on in this moment. So I just want to say very quickly that the other thing that changes is in culture in the West, women could be masculine and men could be feminine, and it was not assumed that they were homosexual. It was not assumed. I'm not saying it was acceptable in all contexts. So in a performative sense, men could be feminine. And in certain settings, they could be more feminine versions of a man. And the same for women. There's all kinds of women in the 10s and 20s who dressed in a very masculine style. And the masculine woman, what you see here in that image, is Radcliffe Hall, who was a very well-known, also extremely racist and fascist lesbian who wrote the first quote-unquote lesbian novel that came out, I think it was 1928, and she's there with her partner, Una Troubridge. Very complicated woman, but she, as you can see, really embodies this masculine style. Okay, so by the middle of the century, in the 20s and 30s in the United States, a doctor named George Henry, he decides that he is going to find the cause of homosexuality by looking in the body. So he thinks you can find it in the body. And so this is a drawing from his textbooks. And what he's arguing here is that lesbians have a larger vulva, as we can see from this drawing. And he also argued that lesbians had a larger clitoris. So because they had we know that the clitoris is for pleasure. And so lesbians are interested in pleasure. It was assumed at that time that proper white women didn't particularly like sex. They didn't find it pleasant. So if a woman was a sexual woman, she would have a larger clitoris, right? You can see the correlation that's being made in their minds at the time. So that was a really big theory that George Henry developed, is you can tell by the size of a woman's clitoris whether or not she is a lesbian. Okay, so those are the medical doctors. But so what do historians of sexuality think? So I really like to use this quote by Gore Vidal. So Gore Vidal was a well-known American essayist, intellectual. He hung around with the Kennedys, the elites. He was bisexual, and he was openly bisexual at a time. So I'm talking the 40s and 50s and 60s here, where it was very terrifying to be a homosexual in that particular period. But he was able to pull it off. And he wrote a book in 1948 that had a gay character that was a neutral character, so neither a negative character nor positive. And as a result of that, he never had any success until later in the 70s. He was kind of blacklisted just simply for writing a neutral gay character. Anyway, so early 1970s, gay liberation has happened, and it's becoming more acceptable to talk about homosexuality. Indeed, everybody's talking about homosexuality in the mainstream media. So he gets interviewed by this guy, and this guy asks him, was your first sexual partner male or female? And Vidal responds, I was too polite to ask. So think about that answer for a minute. What is Vidal? Why do you think Vidal responds in this way? What is he saying with that response? So one of the reasons why I like it so much to communicate how historians think about sexuality, how it's different from how we think about it in mainstream society, is that it denies the significance of the sex and the gender of the body of the person with whom one is engaging in sexual relations. It says it's completely insignificant. And I love that. I just think it's totally brilliant. So you may not think it's insignificant, and that's fine. So I want to be clear that in any class you take, it's not required that you accept and believe the principles, the theories, the ideas you're being taught, but it is required that you understand them and that you master them. Okay? So you can keep whatever beliefs you want, but it's important that you, when you're asked what historians of sexuality think, that you be able to answer that question. Okay? So, as I mentioned earlier, since the late 1800s, sexuality, this idea of sexuality, so not sex has always been important, especially in the West, in the Catholic Church, the way it's regulated, and other religions too, of course. There's lots and lots of regulations around sexuality. Sex has always been important, but sex has always been seen in those contexts as an act, right? Like a sin. But sexuality, this thing of who you are, your essential being as a person, your fundamental nature, this has come to play a central role in defining who we are as individuals. Sexual orientation and sexual identity are modern constructs. They're produced by culture, not biology, not by nature. Okay? So that is our operating framework. So at its core, it rejects, in a sense, gay and lesbian identity. It doesn't, if you say, or I say, or someone says, you know, I'm a gay or lesbian, it doesn't mean that a historian of sexuality says, no, you're not. Although sometimes we think it. Just kidding, but not really. I say I'm queer, I've said I'm lesbian, I've said all kinds of things like that. Those identities are really important. So it's not that we deny those identities, but it's that when we go into the past, that's what we do, that's our terrain, we're not looking to find the gays or the lesbians, okay? Because that's what we call presentist. That's taking present day ideas and values and imposing them on the past. Now, I just will say quickly, not all historians agree with this. There are a couple historians who have published articles and books making a different argument. I won't get into that. It's just important at this point that you understand that this idea is one of the main ideas shaping the history of sexuality. Sexual practices and desires do not define who we are, but of course they do, right? So this is an understanding of this about our own sexuality in the present day, but also in the past, right? That the sexual practices people engaged in and the desires they had also defined them. Okay, how many of you, by a show of hands, have in our culture encountered the message, sex is good? Okay. How many of you in our culture have encountered the message, sex is bad? Show of hands. So my question is, how is it that we can have both messages? Like, how can sex be both good and bad? Like, which is it? So the point I want to make here is that there are all kinds of ways of thinking about sex in our society. We mustn't make the mistake when we look at the past of thinking that they were simpler, that there was only one way of thinking about sex. It's not true. Past societies were just as complex, just as diverse as ours. Diverse in different ways, complex in different ways, and that's our job to understand that. But it's important to realize that as messed up as sex is in our culture today, it's also messed up or just unusual or different or complicated, that's the word I want, in the past as well. So keep that in mind, right? There's no one answer to anything. I like to share this cartoon that came out, as you can imagine, about, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. I can't remember where it was published. But this, to me, really expresses the link between gender, sexuality, and culture. So this is about a moment in the history of the West where we are at war with the Muslim world. And who becomes part of that war? Women's bodies, right? Women. They become something over which men fight. And as you can see in this case, this is about a patriarchal society, both sides being patriarchal and both sides deciding what is right. You know, and the point here being that the woman has no say in it. She's a symbol. She's almost not real. She's almost irrelevant, right, in this context. So this is a really good example of how the arguments we have over sexuality are cultural, political, economic, and social, right? How they get created and how they're historically specific. Okay. Now we get into the really, I gotta have another sip of water. So there's a lot of words on the page here, but these concepts are important. So I want you to understand them and I want you to have them accessible to you. And I'll share the PowerPoint slide so you can come back to this without having to go through the whole video. So that's Michel Foucault, the French philosopher who I mentioned earlier, who said that the homosexual was invented in the 1880s. To say that sexuality is socially constructed. So let me explain what that means. You've probably heard this term before, but it's to say that it's made in society, right? Society haunts the body's sexuality. Excuse me. So to say that sexuality is socially constructed is to say more than that we live with social expectations and scripts. So think about the cartoon I just showed you, right? Those are social expectations and scripts that are imposed on women, right? So when we say sexuality is socially constructed, it means more than that we have these expectations and scripts. It is to say that it is a set of historically describable discourses. So historically describable discourses, what he means is that we can understand them in the context of their time, and we can understand them as products of history, right? Things that have happened over time, which constitute sexuality as an object of knowledge and social concern. So that's what he's saying, is that sexuality in our society, in the modern West, we treat it as an object of sexuality, as an object of knowledge and social concern. So it's something to be concerned about, right? We need to be concern ourselves with sexuality. And, you know, there's always something, right? Like when I was growing up, it was teenage pregnancy because abortion and birth control wasn't as readily available. So teenage pregnancy was, and VD, that was the big thing, right? Of course, then there was the AIDS crisis and homosexuality. But at the beginning of the 20th century, it was masturbation. I mean, nobody was talking about homosexuality. They were talking about masturbation of young boys, because there was a concern that, going back to the concern about the white race and reproductive health, there was a belief that men had a limited amount of sperm. And so the more you masturbated, the more you wasted your seed. And so you would give birth to weak babies. They really believed that. That was medical knowledge at that time. So sexuality is an object of social concern. So that's not concern about your biology. That's concern about white supremacy, white dominance. That's a social concern, a political concern, right? It's not a concern for you and your body. So here's the longer quote. Sexuality must not be thought of as a kind of natural given, which power tried to hold in check. So what he's doing is he's going through the ways we often think about sexuality, right? So it's a natural given. So if we were all left free, we would have open sexuality. We would all be polyamorous and, you know, non-gendered. We would all just be truly free, right? And but power, you know, the forces of power in our society holds us in check for their own purposes, like white supremacy, right? So he says, no, sexuality is not like this kind of this natural thing. And it's not an obscure domain which knowledge tries gradually to uncover. So if we just do more science and better science, eventually we will unlock the mystery, all the mysteries of sexuality. And that has been our approach so far. He says it's neither of those things. It is the name that can be given to a historical construct, not a furtive reality that is difficult to grasp, but a great surface network in which the stimulation of bodies, the intensification of pleasures, the incitement to discourse, the formation of special knowledges, the strengthening of controls and resistances are linked to one another in accordance with a few major strategies of knowledge and power. So in a way, he is saying power is trying to hold things in check. Okay, so that is happening. But that sexuality is this invented idea that is really best thought about as part of a system of power, right? So it's a great surface network. That's what sexuality is. And so all these things are power. It kind of works to manipulate us, society, in particular ways as a strategy, right, for its own ends. So encouraging white people not to masturbate, to get married and have more children, that is an example of power encouraging a sort of the stimulation of bodies and intensification of pleasures. So there's a lot there. Take some time with it. And if you have any questions, bring them to class. Okay, so it seems hard, but Janelle Monae has a song about it. So if Janelle Monae can sing about it, I figure you can grasp what Foucault's saying. So here's some lyrics from a song by Janelle. See, if everything is sex except sex, which is power, you know, power is just sex. You screw me and I'll screw you too. Everything is sex except sex, which is power. You know, power is just sex. Now ask yourself, who's screwing you? All right, so there you go. Janelle Monae, we're updating the Lady Gaga. So it doesn't mean, though, that we're all victims who have no ability to determine our own fates or make any decisions on our own. Foucault also says wherever you find power, you find resistance. Okay, so a couple of more ways to help us think about when we're trying to understand sexuality as historians. What are we doing? So we will operate from the assumption that, or the principle that sex is not fixed and unchanging. It is not an essential part of human nature. That whole idea that it is a construct. It's a form of knowledge. It's an idea that was invented, and it serves a purpose. We are not animals driven to procreate. We are, which is what biology texts tell us, right? That's our natural drive, is to procreate. And I always ask my students at this point in the lecture, like, how many of you have had sex for the purpose of procreation, versus having had sex, right? So usually it's no one. But sometimes I have students who have kids. So yeah, we like to have sex, but not to procreate always. And so how do you account for that, right? So the religion, it's always been, well, that's sinful. Okay, we are complex human beings whose lives are lived at the intersection of race, gender, sexuality, and other, I would add to this now, ability for sure. And that the meanings attached to sex organize social relations and change over time. So these are really important foundational principles to what we're looking for. So we're not looking to understand, we're not looking to find, to give you an example, we're not looking to find gay people in the past. We're looking to understand what meanings were attached to sex and how did those meanings organize social relations and how did those meanings change over time. Those are the questions we're always asking. Now, many of us, like myself, we're interested in same-sex sex, right? So that's what we're looking for in the archives, is instances of same-sex sex. But we're not looking for gay people to say, look, see, there's gay people in the past, which is a valid thing to do, but that's not what critical scholarly historians do. So you can maybe see where there might be a tension between what we do as scholars and what public history does. So the kinds of questions we ask are about the relationships between class, gender, race, to creating meanings about sexuality. What role has sexuality played in shaping modern identity, and why? Why has it played that particular role? How can we understand the range of social attitudes and beliefs in the modern West about the meaning and nature of sexuality? And how do we understand change over time? So these, again, guiding questions that we use in this field. And you can probably see commonalities if you replace the word with sexuality with, I don't know, the nature of work, right? What role has the work we do, played in shaping modern identity, and why? I mean, a lot of these things, these are just basically a historical approach. Okay. Foucault also said, knowledge is not for knowing. Knowledge is for cutting. Now, why do you think he said that? What do you think he means? So I want you to spend some time thinking about that. Write down your answer and bring it to class on Tuesday, and we'll talk about some of your interpretations. Because remember, consider the fact that he talks about knowledge as a form of power, and he's doing this to critically expose how power operates, but yet he is a producer of knowledge. It's a hall of mirrors out there. Okay. What is the yellow section of this image? What is that? Okay, I'm going to tell you what it is. That is a clitoris. Now, most people have no idea. They have no clue that this is what a clitoris is. This is the size of a clitoris. This is the shape of a clitoris, right? Most people think it's the small section of your genitalia, that we saw in the George Henry. Oh, what was that? In the George Henry drawings, right? That he did in 1948. But in fact, this is your clitoris. So I'm going to show you a quote here, a medical doctor talking about why we don't know this, why this is not known. The medical literature tells us the truth about our contempt for women. For 3 centuries, there are thousands of references to penile surgery, nothing on the clitoris, except for some cancers or dermatology, and nothing about how to restore its sensitivity, which is his area of expertise. The very existence of an organ of pleasure is denied medically. Today, if you look at the anatomy books that all surgeons have, you will find 2 pages on the subject. There is a real intellectual excision. Now, I don't actually remember offhand when this quote is from, but it's quite recent, like maybe the last 5 years, 4 years. It's quite recent. So this is why linking back to the image of the vagina at the beginning, right? And I said, you probably think, well, we know so much more, right? That the body is knowable. But the point I am making here is, I agree that the body is knowable, but society, culture, our cultural values continues to shape even a supposedly objective, value-free, neutral discipline such as medical science. And here we have a doctor, in his opinion, this is a product of our contempt for women. I mean, it's really interesting to me. This is one of the interesting contradictions of our society. So in our society, men purportedly love sex, right? Men can't get enough of it. And they would just have sex all day, every day if they had their way, right? And yet, here is an organ, the only organ in the human body, any human body, that exists solely for the purpose of pleasure. It has no other function. No other body has this organ. So if men control medical science and men love sex and sexual pleasure, why isn't this the first thing they studied? This is the part that I love about doing history, because to me, that seems like an obvious question. I mean, if you love sex so much and you're really into pleasure, why wouldn't this be the first thing you'd want to know about, right? So there's nothing easy or simple or straight. There are no straight lines here. There are no straight lines. Humans are kind of weird. They think and act in strange ways that are not always easily explained. But there's always power in it anyways, at least in this story. There's always power in it. And, Foucault would have said in every story, there's power. Okay. So can reading gay history make you gay? Well, sure, why not, right? I mean, what we're doing here is opening up your mind to questioning all these categories that we've been taught to take for granted, to assume as natural and real and tangible, to use to identify ourselves. We face pressure, especially as teenagers, right? What are you? Who are you? Identify this way or that way, right? So once you start sort of looking at and really paying attention to what you actually desire and what you actually feel, as opposed to what you've learned to express and communicate because that's what's permissible or acceptable, you might discover some interesting things about yourself. Who knows? But it's not the act of reading gay history that makes you gay, right? So it's not infectious. Well, it's infectious, intellectually, because it's a really interesting field. But It won't make you gay. So you're okay. All right. So I won't talk about these, but in my undergraduate class, I always give them sample exam questions so they understand what is the key concept. So I'll leave them there for you, so you have them and you can review them. But I just added a couple slides to refer to some of the content in our readings. So I love this quote by Anais Nin. You don't see the world as it is, you see it as you are. That's really interesting. I was just part of a training on what's called Indigenous cultural safety. And they had us do an exercise to talk about how do you see the university? And then how might an Indigenous person see those same structures? So that's an example of exactly what Anais Nin is saying, right? You don't see the world as it is, you see it as you are, right? Through your own eyes, and that's your experience, right? And your context. Okay, so here is a quote from the Mills article. Queer history exhibitions will be a mode of display, collecting, and curating, driven not by a desire for a petrified, quote, history as it really was, but by the recognition that interpretations change and that our encounters with archives are saturated with desire. So he wants us to think about what is it we're desiring in doing this. So we can think about the monument, right? And think back on the documentary. Like, what is the desire of the people who were pushed out of the government and pushed out of the military, who were fired, and in some cases abused physically and psychologically? What is their desire, right? They have a very strong desire with this monument. And historians, he's drawing our attention to the fact that our encounters with the archives are also saturated with desire. Should the queer museum contain the same kinds of things as any other museum? I sincerely hope not. So what he's pointing to here, and what I want to point your attention to, is doing queer history is not about simply adding queer people to the existing story, but it's about doing things differently, right? And so the questions that I've explored with you here in this lecture are what I mean by doing things differently. When you ask different questions, it's a different project. So it's not reproducing history as it is, but rather it's queering history. Okay, here's a quote from another article, which I actually took off the syllabus this term, but I just wanted to have a look at it. History is always interpreted. Facts don't speak for themselves. Evidence has to be cemented together with imagination and interpretation. Historians don't actually usually think about imagination because we tend to kind of have this idea that we're neutral and objective, or at least, I mean, I don't think anybody actually believes that anymore, but there's this pretense in history, right? That if you assemble all the facts and there's only one interpretation, like that's how we write up an article. There's really only one conclusion you can come to, and here's what it is, right? And that's usually how we present it. But it's a process of interpretation and also imagination. And so here's another point of connection between what historians do and what's going to happen with the monument. The designer of the monument is going to have to interpret and imagine, right? So they're using different tools, and it's a different audience. It's not a scholarly audience, but there are some overlaps between the two. Okay, if you're interested in learning more about some of the sources that I shared in this lecture, there's the links. And that, my friends, is the end. That was a lot of material. So make sure you do two things. One, take time to review. Okay? Take time to review this material because it's important that you grasp it. Remember, there's a tension between scholarly history and public history, and that is the tension that exists throughout this course, right? So you need to understand what the scholarly history approach is. And you need to be able to reflect back now on last week's readings and identify where tensions might emerge. Okay? So that's how we build incrementally on each week's teachings. There's something else I was going to say. Oh, yeah. And write down your questions and bring them on Tuesday. So there will be a Q&A. So just to remind you, there will be a Q&A section, and then I will open it up to questions from everybody, and then you go off into your study pod. Actually, it would make sense to do it the other way around, wouldn't it? Because this is a new format, right? I think I'm going to have you work in makes more sense. Okay, you're going to work in your study pods first for the first hour, and then we'll do the Q&A in the second hour. Yeah, that makes more sense. And then we can open it up to questions after the presentation by group one. But it may end up, because for the reason I sent out that email to you, it may end up just being an open Q&A. We'll see what happens. Who knows? It's all mysterious. Okay. Have a great day.